How is the inner work going? Ian, how are you doing?
It's going good. I've been doing a lot of the 60 bone exercise, and I've been doing the digesting air exercise, um, for my post meditation after because um, one of the things Gurdjieff had talked about was being in a relaxed state. I find that after I've been sitting, I'm very relaxed, physically at least, um, and yeah, it's been going good. I don't have much to report. The 60 bones, it's been a lot of ups and downs with my ability to do that in the mornings, as we've talked about. Um, there was one morning it took me 2 hours to get through the whole thing. There was one morning it took me half an hour. I mean, I kept falling asleep, so
Okay.
I wasn't working at it for 2 hours. But my alarm goes off at 8. It wakes me up. I start doing it, and I try to run through it 3 times. So I run through it 3 times. It's all of a sudden I look at the clock. It's 10:20.
Okay.
10:15 something. That morning it's like not even 8:30 yet. So there's been a lot of a good struggle with it, I would say.
For me, actually, in the last few days, it's like my energy's just gone. And I understand why, because of my week and everything that I went through. It's like, get back to myself, come back to myself, come back to myself. But if you don't have the energy, if it's not there, you can't really force it. You either have the energy for inner work, you've either conserved it by not doing the things that we generally tend to do. And let me see if I can do this again. According to Gurdjieff, there are 7 things that will stop us, that we waste the energy with, and identification, internal considering. And as I mentioned before, internal considering is really a subset of identification, but he lists it as a separate quality. So identification is when we get so lost in something, we're not there. A lot of people do it when they're online, they're on the computer, they forget all about themselves. And internal considering is a form of identification where we're thinking about ourselves. Oh, I can't believe it's raining on me, and oh, that person looked at me the wrong way, and we're always puffing ourselves up internally with a sense of self-importance. Monsieur Self-Love and Madame Vanity, that are keeping us in this belief that people should be acknowledging our greatness, so to speak. Another way we lose energy is through lying. I realize that journalists do this all the time. They go and interview a few people, they write an article as if they know what they're talking about, and all they're doing is quoting what someone told them, and they're regurgitating information. And we do this a lot, where we regurgitate information and we say things without really understanding it. So lying isn't necessarily being deceptive. It's claiming to know things and to have a higher authority in terms of understanding than we really do. If you share a belief that's held by 10 million people, it's not your belief. It's something you absorbed. And beliefs are actually shorthands. They're shortcuts so that we don't have to think through things too deeply. It's just like this mental habit that we can just click into place without really having to ponder things and come to our own conclusions. So identification, internal considering, lying. I'm just trying to think of the negative emotions. So getting really upset, but not all negative emotions are bad. This is a mistake that came from Uspensky. 99% of negative emotions are bad, and you can taste the negative emotions that are bad because at the base of them there's some kind of ego, like, how could they say that to me? You get angry, or I'm so frightened. There's a subjective me quality to that. Another way we waste energy is through formatory thinking. That's just the words that circle around our head. And I've got to 5. I keep on telling myself I'm going to memorize these. and I put them on my screen. I memorize them, and then I forget them, and they fall out of my mind. I guess that's one of the perils of getting older. Just give me a second. I'll find it.
Line, negative.
Yeah.
It's Ben there.
Hey, Ben.
Yeah, hello, Ben.
So yeah,
Ben
just
is,
oh, Ben is coming. There's Ben. Hello, Ben. Hey, welcome back.
how are you?
Hello.
Welcome back.
Hello.
Yeah. I'm just
Yes, it's good to be back.
I'm just going through the 7 ways that we leak energy. So identification.
Okay.
So identification is when we
Mhm.
completely lose ourselves in something. If you go to a movie and you're so focused on the movie screen, you're not even aware of yourself. That's a state of identification. Also, to actually believe that I'm a Canadian is a form of identification. Identification is when our awareness is so focused on something else, our attention is absorbed in something else, we lose any kind of an awareness of ourself. A form of identification is considering, and considering is where we put our. How could they say that to me? It's a lot of the self-talk that goes on inside our head, and then there is negative emotions, and not all negative emotions are bad. Only 99.9% of them are bad. Negative emotions can be some kind of foreshadowing, but it's when there's the ego involved and it's me. How can they do that to me? Anger, or I'm so depressed. My life is terrible. Another one is unnecessary talking. So that's where we talk too much, speaking too much. Just some people just chatter and chatter and chatter. My mother was like that. Chatter. I spent Thursday with my sister, and she chattered. Just, I call it nattering, from when it comes to members of my family. Another one is lying, and lying is not necessarily being deceptive. It's claiming more authority and more understanding than we have. You know, talking about the problems in the Middle East as if we know what's going on, or talking about what's going on in Donald Trump's mind, or whatever. Then there's formatory thinking, which is a very mechanical form of thinking. That's the repetitive, habitual thinking that is going on around in our mind. And then we daydreaming and imagination. There's a lot of noise. I think it's coming from you, Ben. Just background.
Okay, hold on, let me.
It just seems like a background noise. You know, is there any way that you can turn your speaker down, or I'm not sure.
Okay.
Can you speak?
Okay, so I can mute myself and you can see if it's still there.
Yeah, okay, there's not a lot of background noise now, so it seems to be fine now. So just again, briefly, and I've pulled it up on a list, the 7 features of sleep, in other words, the 7 ways that we leak energy: identification, internal considering, negative emotions, unnecessary talking, lying, formatory thinking, daydreaming, and imagination. And daydreaming and imagination is the use of the intellectual center's capability to visualize and think, and it's hijacked by the emotional center, and underneath it was the ego, and it's the sense of self-importance, the me. So if we do too much formatory thinking, that's just the habitual thoughts that swirl around in our mind. We're wasting energy. We waste energy when we claim to know things that we can't possibly know. Well, yeah, well, I think Donald Trump is a psychopath. You know, psychiatrists, they will not diagnose people unless they actually see them in person. Or, you know, what they should be doing in Turkey right now. And, you know, how do we know what's going on there? So we claim authority, we claim an understanding that we don't normally have. And these are the different ways that we leak energy. You know, for me, when I was a kid, teenager, it used to be through daydreaming. I would be lying at home and I would imagine myself in scenarios like an emergency firemen putting out fires or pulling people out of cars or whatever. It's quite, you know, when I think back on it now, and I think of all the time I wasted doing that, it was quite unreal. So if we don't have the proper energy, if we haven't conserved the energy through through fixing the leaks at the lower level, we don't have the energy to do the higher work. So this is something important to think about. I will be going through each one of those, you know, in further meetings. But it's just to become aware of what is inhibiting our inner work. If we do not have the energy for inner work, it's really hard to do. We can hack the process slightly. For instance, you can go to a mindfulness meditation meetup and sit in a room with other people, but you could be there just looking just exactly like everyone else with your eyes half closed, and you could still be thinking in your mind, whirling away, and you might not be fully present in that moment, and no one would be able to tell, but you would. But there is an energy that we can get from group meetings and doing things as a group that can help. But unless we really begin to look at ourselves, to begin to understand ourselves at the mechanical level, we will not realize where we are leaking energy. You know, I've brought it up before. Just give me a second. I wasn't fully going to talk about this today, so you know, the human being, the 3-story factory. We are leaking. You know, the square down at the bottom. We're 3-story beings, and if we don't have enough of the higher energy, what Mr. Gurdjieff called hydrogen 24, we can't really do the inner work. So we've got to figure out where we're leaking the energy, where we are drawing the energy down, whether it's through the lucid emotions, which is feeding the moon, the homicidal emotions, road rage, absolute terror, a complete wallowing in subjectivity, you know, real despair. And then there's the energy that we lose through the mechanical manifestations. Lying is a mechanical manifestation, so is identification. Mr. Gurdjieff said that psychology is really beyond most people's ability to study. Most people live at the mechanical level, and he said rather than psychology, they have to study mechanics. If you go back to St. Paul, where he talked about soma, psyche, pneuma, in the middle square, soma is equal to world 48. It's equal to the physical world. Psyche is equal to world 24. This is the realm of mindful awareness or personal consciousness. And pneuma is the equivalent of the level of the real I, or world 12, or hydrogen 12. So he said that at the level of 48, where most people are centered, rather than calling it psychology, it's better to call it mechanics, the study of mechanics. And psychology, because, you know, soma, psyche, pneuma, psychology is really best the study of world 24. So I'll talk a bit about some of this in a minute, but let's do an inner exercise. I really like the inner exercise that I have learned through George Adi, a different way of self-sensing. So let's just use our head, be aware of our head, be aware of the importance of our head when it comes to directing our attention. And let's just use our head to direct our attention to our right shoulder. Then use our head to direct our attention to our right upper arm, our right elbow and the bend in our right arm, our right lower arm, our right wrist, the palm of our right hand, our right thumb, our right index finger, middle finger, fourth finger, baby finger, the top of our right hand, and moving back up, our right wrist, lower arm, elbow, upper arm, right to our right shoulder, and then just become aware of our entire right arm. Sense our right arm at once, while also maintaining a degree of awareness of these separate points. So aware of your whole right arm and aware of the shoulder, the upper arm, elbow, lower arm, wrist, hands, fingers. And then, while maintaining this awareness of your right arm, become aware of your right hip, your right upper leg, your right knee and the bend behind your right knee, your right shin and calf, your right ankle, the bottom of your right foot, including your instep, right up to your toes. And then become aware of your big toe, your second toe, your third toe, your fourth toe, and your baby toe. And then become aware of the top of your right foot and moving back up again, your right ankle, lower leg, knee, upper leg, up to your right hip. And become aware of your whole right leg, while also remaining aware of your whole right arm. And hold both of these in your awareness. Bring your attention to both your right arm and your right leg, and become aware of your left hip, your left upper leg, your left knee and the bend behind your knee, your left shin and calf, your left ankle, the bottom of your left foot, including your instep, right up to the tips of your toes, and then your left baby toe, your left fourth toe, your left middle toe, your left second toe, your left big toe, the top of your left foot, your left ankle, your left lower leg, knee, upper leg, right up to your left hip, and becoming aware of your whole left leg while aware of your right leg and right arm. And while aware of these three limbs, your right arm, right leg, and left leg, become aware of your left shoulder, your left upper arm, your left elbow and the bend in your left arm, your left lower arm, your left wrist, the palm of your left hand, your left baby finger, your left fourth finger, your left middle finger, index finger, thumb, the top of your left hand, your left wrist, forearm, elbow, upper arm, right back up to the shoulder, and become aware of your entire left arm, while also remaining aware of your left leg, your right leg, and your right arm. Become aware of all four of these limbs at once. And Mr. Gurdjieff actually talks to his students in transcripts of the book that's now called G.I. Gurdjieff, Paris Meetings 1943, where he talks about how we can receive energy from the universe, and where we receive things through our limbs, that our limbs are like receiving apparatuses. So it's very important to really develop this awareness of our four limbs, the right arm, right leg, left arm. And it seems to be that this is the way we develop it. Right arm, right leg, left arm when we build it up, and then to become aware of all of them at once, all four limbs. And then just briefly make sure that your spine is proper and that your head is resting on your neck, which is resting on your shoulders, which is resting on your spine, which is resting on your pelvic bone. And bring your awareness, while maintaining this awareness of all four limbs, bring your awareness to the base of your spine. And there are 5 lumbar vertebrae in the base of your spine. So imagine as best you can working up the 5 lumbar vertebrae. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then work up the 12 thoracic vertebrae that go right up to our shoulders. So 1, 2, 3, up through the middle back, 4, up by our shoulder blades, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and the 7 cervical vertebrae in our neck. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And let's just quickly in our own mind go back down to the base of our spine and just sort of as if we're playing a piano, you know, keys moving up. Just imagine moving up your awareness, up your spine. So sensing from the bottom, moving up to the top of your spine where it connects with your skull. And become aware of all 4 limbs and your spinal column. And then become aware of the occipital bone in the very back of your skull, the temporal and parietal bones at the sides and top of your skull, and then move down into the frontal bone in the front of your skull. Aware of all 4 limbs, your spine, and these various plates or bones in your skull. And then move into your eye sockets. Bring your awareness into your eye sockets and become aware of your eyes like 2 spheres almost floating in your eye sockets. And then move your awareness down into your nasal passages and then down to the roof of your mouth and then down to where your teeth meet your lips and then down to your tongue resting at the bottom of your mouth, your tongue pressing against the front teeth, and then just down into your jaw and the fleshy part underneath, just located just underneath your tongue. And then move your awareness again, all 4 limbs, the spine, the skull, the eye sockets, nasal passage, roof of mouth, teeth, lips, tongue, jaw, into the throat, then down into your whole chest. Become aware of it, your whole chest, your solar plexus, your lower abdomen, right down to your sexual organs. So become aware of all 4 limbs, and then it moves up the back, down through the front. So all 4 limbs, spine, skull, the nasal passage, roof of mouth, teeth, lips, tongue, jaw, throat, chest, solar plexus, abdomen, down to the sexual organs. And try your best to sense yourself, to sense all of these points together, to become aware of all of these points together. And while holding this awareness, let's take this one step further. I won't go into the full complex exercise because I am still deconstructing it. And I'm going to be pulling in different sources when I finally do this exercise and release it online. But let's go to the old understanding of breathing. So become aware of those points of your body. Become aware of your whole body. Become aware of the sensorial, the sensation aspect of breathing. How you can sense the air perhaps flowing in through your nose, nasal cavity, back of mouth, throat, vocal cord, down into your lungs. This is the sensation of the flow of air. And how you can become aware of the sensation of your lungs inflating and deflating, pulling air in and pushing it out. And how you can also become aware of the sensation of the various muscles involved, the diaphragm moving down the diaphragmatic cavity and back up as you inhale and exhale, the movement of the muscles in the abdomen. So become aware of the sensorial, the sensory dimension of breathing while remaining aware of your 4 limbs, spine, skull, face inside of the mouth, becoming aware of the sensory dimension of breathing. And then become aware of this energy in your mind that can follow your breath in and back out. So aware of your body and following your breath in and then following it back out. Breathing at your own pace. Don't breathe in conjunction with my words. Just following your breath in and back out, sensing your body breathing. And then as you breathe in, represent however you can to yourself, using Madame de Salzman's description, represent to yourself that you are breathing in active elements from the air. And as you breathe out, using Mr. Gurdjieff's words, imagine you're breathing out something like, the color of an exhaled cigarette, some kind of a gray, foggy waste. breathing in active elements from the air and breathing out a gray fog, sensing your whole body, sensing your breathing, but imagining as you breathe in, you're breathing in active elements, and as you're breathing out this gray, depleted air. And then as you breathe in, breathe your breath down into your solar plexus. And as you breathe out, imagine that something remains in your solar plexus. Breathing in, representing that you're breathing in the active elements, and then breathing out that gray waste, and representing to yourself, imagining that something remains in your solar plexus. Mr. Gurdjieff said, where it goes, what it does, that's its own business. So just aware of your breath, breathing in the active elements, and as you breathe out the gray waste, something remains in your solar plexus. And we can actually take it one step farther. I don't want to take it to the next two steps because it gets a little complex. But as you breathe in, representing that you're breathing in these active elements, and then you're breathing out that gray waste, breathing in these active elements, imagine that something remains in your solar plexus, and that this energy, whatever it is that remains, then seeps down to your sexual organs. Breathing in, and as you breathe out, something remains that seeps down to your sexual organs. Breathing in these active elements, breathing out that gray waste, and imagining something flowing down to your sexual organs. Breathing in this active elements, breathing out the gray waste, something remains that flows down, and focusing on this dimension of breathing while remaining aware of your four limbs, spine, skull, mouth, chest, solar plexus, the physical dimensions of your body. And then imagine something from your head brain, perhaps coming in through the crown of your head. Some kind of energy comes in with your breath, that you breathe this head brain energy down with the breath, and it stays there as you breathe out, as something remains. And as that something remains, moves down to your solar plexus. Breathing in, something remains in your solar plexus that flows down to your sexual organs, and breathing out the gray waste. Breathing in, uniting something with your head, with your breath, down into your solar plexus that flows down to your sexual organs as you breathe out that gray waste. And this is how we absorb the higher elements of the air that we need in order to do the inner work that we do. So just let's finish with the atmosphere, the collected state exercise. This is a good way to finish exercises. So imagine, represent to yourself, become aware that you are surrounded by an atmosphere, perhaps a meter, meter and a half. And things enter this atmosphere, but nothing leaves it, that you keep the atmosphere contained. You keep your thoughts contained in it. You keep your feelings, your sensations contained within this atmosphere. My voice can enter it. The air can enter it. Qualities can enter it, but you keep it contained. Imagine this atmosphere, tranquil, still, serene, surrounding you. Represent this atmosphere to yourself. Sense it, feel it, become aware of it. And in a moment, I'm going to count to 3. And when I get to 3, you imagine breathing it in, and then follow again as you breathe out the gray waste. Something remains that flows down to your sexual organs from this atmosphere. Using this to help bring these molecules into ourselves that we can use to grow our being. So surrounded by an atmosphere. 1, 2, 3. Just breathe it in. You don't have to hold your breath. Breathe it out and imagine something remains. And then let's finish by silently repeating in our minds, may results from this exercise be transubstantiated within me for my being. And, as I said, this week, it was actually the first anniversary of my brother's death. So I was a bit scattered with my sister and family. So I haven't been doing the inner work, the capability of doing the inner work I normally do, but I should have done this exercise. I probably would have had the ability to do more inner work. This brings in those higher, more refined hydrogens that we need in order to really work on ourselves at a higher level. I'm just going to go back now to the diagram I was talking about or showing. Mechanical man, mindful man, conscious man. Waking sleep, personal consciousness, objective consciousness. These are the levels of consciousness. Most people live in the level of waking sleep. To awaken to ourself here in this environment is to become personally conscious. So this is the actual step. The first step up on the mystical path is the step into what Mr. Gurdjieff termed personal consciousness. Now this step has another name, which is greater currency in our society, which comes from Buddhism, which is mindfulness. So the first step towards awakening is to develop our skills of mindful awareness. Now, there are processes involved in this. So the first step up is to become aware as fully as we can of ourselves, of the environment, of various different things. But there are 3 different forms of mindfulness. This is something they don't really go so much into in Buddhism, and particularly the psychologists and psychiatrists and academics who teach people mindfulness in the West. They don't realize that there are 3 separate and distinct molecules, energies that fuel mindful awareness. And just in this center diagram, if you can see where my cursor is, La 24 is the energy that fuels the sensation of self. So the awareness of our 4 limbs, our spine, our skull, the inside of our face and mouth and chest, and that is fueled by Law 24. The sensation of our breath going in and going out is fueled by Law 24. Ray 24 over at the far side, Ray 24, and these are notes, musical notes, do, re, mi. Ray 24 is the external impressions. So Ray 24 fuels our ability to become, for instance, mindful of the screen, mindful of our voice, mindful of the screen and the room and different things, mindful of what we can smell, mindful of the taste in our mouth. And Mr. Gurdjieff defines the first conscious shock as occurring here at Do 48. But we bring this higher energy, this Ray 24, into the process. And he said it's becoming aware, for instance, become aware, sense your eyes, be aware of your eyes receiving light, receiving visual impressions. Become aware of your ears, receiving sounds, and the sounds you're receiving. Become aware of your nose, receiving smells, scents. Become aware of your taste buds, receiving the taste in your mouth. And he said that this awareness of these organs of perception, the eyes, ears, nose, mouth, receiving impressions doubles the potency of these impressions. And if you understand, Gurdjieffian psychology and the difference between one level and another, so the difference between world 48 and world 24 is that world 24, it's a doubling of the vibration, a doubling of the intelligence. So, when he talks about receiving the impressions is like a doubling of the impressions, what he means is it's lifting it up into the next realm, into world 24. So the proper sequence for learning how to self-remember begins with the working of law 24 of the octave of food, which is the fuel that maintains the sensory awareness of our body. So the awareness of our four limbs, our spine, our skull, our face, down the front to our sexual organs, that is fueled by law 24. Ray 24 of the octave of impressions is the awareness then of what is coming in through our eyes, ears, nose, mouth. That's the next step. So there's a proper form and sequence to receiving impressions, to growing our being. The person who brought mindfulness to the West, Dr. John Kabat-Zinn, a molecular biologist and professor of medicine at the University of Massachusetts, said that mindfulness is like a muscle and that we grow the muscle. And that's an okay analogy. But I think really in terms of understanding the mystical path, that there's a proper form and sequence to developing mindful awareness, and mindfulness is more like a language. A small child has some kind of linguistic capability inside their mind, and they hear people speaking, and they absorb information in a certain way. That's according to the syntax of the language. So they learn, subject, verbs, objects. Initially it's subject verb, I run, I hear, and then they begin to develop other aspects of the language. And I'm only speaking specifically of English. There are many different languages that operate slightly differently, but we as children, we hear a language, and everyone who speaks it around us says it in a certain way. There's a certain form and sequence to the language, and we hear words, and those words coagulate in one of three things: the subject, verb, or object. So in English, we're a subject, verb, object language, but Korean is a subject, object, verb language. Hebrew's a verb, subject, object language. We hear these words in a very specific form and sequence. And then eventually language coalesces within us, and the ability to speak coalesces within us. I believe it's the same with this mindful awareness, stepping up to the next level. If we don't do it in the proper form and sequence, we will create this distorted inner being that prevents us from moving up to the next level. So the proper form and sequence, as I've gone in previous meetings, is to begin with the sensation of self. So to begin with that sensory awareness of the body, the four limbs, the spine, the skull, back, eye sockets, nasal passage, roof of mouth, inside the mouth, teeth and lips and tongue and throat and chest and abdomen, and down to our sexual organs, to develop that sensation of self. And I've talked about this in other meetings, where this has to be in second position. It's got to be there. We've got to get so good at it. It's there in the back of our awareness, because this inhibits the receiving impressions in the wrong order. So we develop this awareness of the sensation of self. And when we get so good at it, we can hold it in the back of our awareness. And then we begin to become aware of receiving impressions. So what we see, hear, smell, taste with our head brain. So basically, the body brain is the octave of food, way here on the left. And then this up here on the right is the octave of impressions. So the head brain becomes like the positive end of a battery, the receiving of impressions, and the body brain becomes the negative end. And we create a current that is feeling. And feeling is the third dimension that we work on. So head brain, body brain, and feeling brain is the proper sequence to becoming mindful. When we do that, each impression we receive, whether it's a sensory impression in our body, or a visual or an auditory, an olfactory or a gustatory impression coming in from the external world, or the impression of a feeling, leaves behind a tiny little crystallization within inside ourselves. We call these crystallizations memories. You know, we can think of a word like buffalo. You can think of a buffalo, you know what the word means, you can imagine a buffalo. That actually exists physically inside yourself. Somehow that memory has been imprinted, it's been crystallized, it's taken form and shape somewhere in your mind, somewhere in your memory. You're not hallucinating it out of the air. The only way you can make sense of the word buffalo and imagine you can see a buffalo is because you've got an image and an understanding somewhere within you. So when I'm talking about crystallizations, I'm talking about the same thing. We've got these things inside ourselves. And every time you focus your attention on something and you learn something, you remember something, you memorize something, you are crystallizing that memory. It's taking some kind of form and shape inside you. So every time we sense our body, we develop the sensation of self. We are leaving behind a higher level crystallization. This is a crystallization in world 24, not the mechanical realm where most people live. We are leaving a slightly higher order crystallization. The same with our visual images that come in, and the auditory and smell and whatever, and the same with our feeling. So there's a proper form and sequence that we really need to develop in terms of mindful awareness, in terms of crystallizing the proper internal structure within inside ourselves. Now we can step back and we can look at this slightly differently. You know, imagine, you know, this middle diagram, or not this middle diagram, the left diagram. You know, imagine that you're a house and you've got a basement which is really dark and fearful emotions and, you know, rage and just things where you lose it. And then your ground floor is very mechanical, very robotic, very habitual. And your upper floor is the mindful realm. And each of these levels is subdivided into 3 rooms. So you've got a gym, you know, a workout room representing the physical body. And then you've got a study, a library representing the intellectual part, the mental part. And then you have an art room representing maybe music and, you know, painting, representing the emotions. And each one of these, so to speak, has a different, is represented by a different colored light on the top floor, the level of mindful awareness. So through identification, through those different aspects of sleep, we waste the energy, we use the energy on the lower floors so that the illumination doesn't occur at the higher level. And so what we want to do is we want to figure out where we are losing that energy so that we can then save it and conserve it and turn on the lights in the upper floor in the proper form and sequence. And the more we work on the ways we're leaking energy, the more we work on turning those lights on in the upper floor, the more it's like our house suddenly moves up the hill by one level and we enter into the realm of the personal consciousness. We move up to the level of proper man, of natural man, where our species should be. Now, there are a number of very interesting things about the mindful state that, again, they don't fully talk about in Western psychology and the way they teach mindfulness in the West. In order to be mindful of my hands, in order to sense the skin in my hands, the bones, the muscles, the insides of my hands, what I really need to do is I need to internally detach from my hands. So to sense my hands, it's like I internally detach from my hands. To sense my whole body from the bottom of my feet to the top of my head, to sense my four limbs, my spine, my skull, the inside of my face, my chest, my abdomen, right down to my sexual organs. I actually have to inwardly detach from my body in order to look at it, in order to observe it. I believe that this is the actual quality, the fact that every form of mindful awareness involves an inward detachment that allows it or makes it so healing. There have been hundreds and hundreds of studies now, double-blind, peer-reviewed academic research studies on mindfulness that prove mindfulness is a powerful psychotherapeutic tool for anxiety, depression, pain, all sorts of things. And I believe it is this ability or this part or the dimension of mindfulness, this inward detachment that makes it so healing. Instead of being caught up in our body, caught up in our pain, caught up in our emotions, when we detach from them, we create this inner separation, this slight inner distance that allows us to cope with them in a better way. So this inward detachment is one of the essential healing feature, I believe, of mindfulness. Now, the Buddha said, life is suffering. Suffering is caused by desire. Desire grows from attachment, and therefore the way to break free from suffering is to practice detachment. And detachment was the seventh spoke of the Buddhist eightfold wheel. Mindfulness, detachment. We learn how to detach. And this brings us to the next sort of understanding. Mindfulness is like shining a light on my hand. And I become aware of my hand. I don't fully realize at the beginning that I'm actually detaching, that I actually have to step back and inwardly separate from my hand in order to sense my hand and perceive my hand. And at the beginning, when I practice mindfulness, I'm focusing on the illumination of my hand and like, wow, I'm sensing my hand. But after a while, you begin to wonder, where's that light coming from? And every act of mindful awareness involves something higher. This is the alchemy of mindfulness. The human organism, let me bring this back up on the screen. So if we go over to where my cursor is, over on the left of the screen, So 48, Law 24, and the carbon at level 12. We need this higher energy, the higher blends with the lower to meet in the middle. This is the alchemical process. That's the definition of alchemy. Higher energy meets with the lower energy, and together they meet in the middle. So you're walking along a beach and you see golden sand, and you take out a pan from your backpack and you begin to pan, and you separate the gold from the sand. You are the actual higher energy that meets the golden sand, and from that you get a pile of gold. In other words, you refine something out of it. This means that within every act of mindful awareness, some higher energy at the level of world 12 is inherent in every act. In order to sense your body, this higher energy has to be present. In order to become aware of the light coming into your eyes, the sound coming into your ears, the smell coming into your nose, the taste in your mouth, in order to develop this ability to be mindful of external impressions, this higher energy is needed. And this is why I believe within Western psychology and the way they treat mindfulness, teach it nowadays, they don't really like to talk about this. Because world 12 is the realm of what Mr. Gurdjieff called the real I. And a lot of people, what is the real I? What is the real I? In Eastern traditions, they've used other phrases that can be translated as the witness, the observer, consciousness itself. So every act of mindful awareness, even though we may not be aware of it, involves this higher, deeper part of ourself, the real I, the witness, the observer. Initially, we can't really be aware of it. It's like my hand being behind my head. I can't see my hand behind my head, but it's there. So there's this awareness of something there, something that's watching, something that's witnessing, something that is observing what is going on. Actually, I shouldn't have got off this quite so. So when we move up to the state of objective consciousness, when the center of gravity, this square on the right, and our center of gravity becomes world 12. This is the realm of the real I. It's the witness, it's the observer. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to grow that dimension of our being so that it's no longer hidden, so that it's no longer in the back of our awareness. We want to bring it out into the front of our awareness. Willem Nyland said it's like a single cell, and we've got to grow it into a multi-cell being by feeding it. So this is part of what we're doing, is to develop that dimension of ourself. Let me just, so mindfulness is this incredibly important dimension, but understanding its threefold nature, understanding that every act of mindfulness involves an inward detachment, and understanding that behind every form of mindful awareness, maybe it's far too refined for us to see, is this higher level of our being. This being, consciousness, the witness, the observer, is implicated in every act of mindful awareness that we have. Now, Mr. Gurdjieff also said it's very important to engage in self-observation. It's very important to begin observing ourselves. Anything in the Gurdjieff teachings that begins with the word self and a hyphen is an act of mindful awareness. And this is where group work becomes important. This is where having friends who are on the path can be important. This is where being involved in a relationship can be very important. Because when we are centered in world 48, where most people live, when we are centered in that mechanical, habitual, and automatic realm, when we are little more than a machine, we are unable to observe ourselves. We are in that mechanical state. If you sent out an email, for instance, to your closest friends and family members, and if you ask them, what is my biggest fault? What do you think my biggest weakness is? And without getting involved in internal considering and getting hurt at their answers, you would be surprised at how much easier or more readily they can see your weaknesses and faults than you can. This is because they can step into that mindful state and watch you in that mechanical state where you are unable to observe yourself. So they can provide information, they can tell you things that you can't really see. And this is one of the reasons why Mr. Gurdjieff talked about the importance of group work, because other people more readily see things in you than you can see in yourself. But all is not lost, because Mr. Gurdjieff talked about learning how to take snapshots of ourselves. And basically, a snapshot is when you move into the mindful state, you have just this trace, this lingering of what you were in the moment before. I have a reverse analogy. I was once in this cupboard in a house in the country, and there was a light hanging in the cupboard, a bulb with a, turning it on and off. And I went in and the cupboard closed behind me and I turned the light off. And so there was no light coming in from the outside. And because I was looking at the light, looking for the thing to pull it off, as I turned it off, the second after I turned it off, the image of the light remained in my mind, in my eyes. And when we self-remember, when we become mindful, particularly with our external impressions and our sensory impressions, when we begin to self-remember, it's like a faint trace, a faint image of our mechanical state lingers ever so briefly. Just becoming aware of one image is nothing. That's like pouring from the empty to the void. Perhaps 1,000 images and 10,000 images are nothing. But the more we self-remember, the more we become mindful in the proper form and sequence, the more pictures we begin to take of ourselves. And the more we have these remaining, these briefly lingering images, the more we can build up this really comprehensive snapshot of ourselves. So we can use this state, to take images, to take pictures, to take snapshots of ourselves at the mechanical level. When we are in the mechanical level, we lack that self-reflectivity, we lack that mindful awareness to really pay attention to what is going on. But the moment I can wake up, I can become mindful, we're coming out of the mechanical state, and that state that we were in, it leaves that faint trace, and we can build up the picture. So we can engage in self-observation, in self-study. We can build this awareness of ourselves. We can begin to see where we leak this energy, whether, let me just go back. So through, where we are lost in identification, or lost in considering the me, or negative emotions, or unnecessary talking, or lying, or formatory thinking, or daydreaming and imagination. Through this act, we can begin to build up pictures of ourselves. And through this understanding of ourselves, we can begin to see the primary ways where we leak energy. And we can begin then attempting to stop those leaks. Now, as I talked about, a number of times that I've mentioned today, just becoming mindful, sensing our four limbs, sensing our spine, our skull inside, and then sort of becoming aware of what we're receiving, auditorily, visually, through our scent, taste, we are bringing ourselves into an alignment. So if we pull ourselves up and we make sure we do it with the proper form and sequence. A metaphor that I've used is like you have this loose thread, and when you pull it, the whole thread straightens. So in this moment, when I'm consciously looking, listening, smelling, tasting, while sensing my body and possibly feeling, definition of self-remembering, I am pulling that thread straight, and I am not leaking this energy at the lower level. Because if I was leaking this energy at the lower level, I wouldn't be able to consciously look, listen, smell, while sensing my body and possibly being aware of my feelings. So in that moment, I'm not leaking energy. I've pulled myself into a greater degree of alignment at the lower level. So by trying to be mindful whenever we can, setting mindfulness bells, setting little alarm clocks, maybe putting stickers on our mirrors or whatever to help us, setting these reminding factors, we are pulling ourselves straight in that moment. So we work at it from above by becoming as mindful as we can, as often as we can in the proper form and sequence. And we have to work at it from below by understanding these different ways that we leak energy. Fortunately, according to Gurdjieff, there are only 7 ways that we leak energy. 7 habits that keep us in that habitual state. And so figuring out where we lose it, to become so caught up in our own illusion of who we are. I'm a Canadian. That imaginary border that we all collectively hallucinate, that's a couple of miles away, that's at the bottom of this deep, immense Lake Ontario, one of the Great Lakes. That imaginary border is sacred, and on this side it's sacred land, and the other side, well, that's just America, and that's all those crazy gun nuts down there. And sorry, I had to throw that one in. That is to get caught up in a real state of identification. So, for instance, Donald Trump supporters, a lot of them are so identified with all of these illusions that really have no basis in reality. They're so identified with that because they're not refined beings. They're not mindful. They're not attempting to elevate their being. They're being brought down to the lowest level in fear, and the media and the politicians and everything are playing on the fact that they're really broken and trying to keep them in a broken state, making them caught up in that. There was a time when I first came back to Canada, downtown, right after a Toronto Maple Leafs hockey game. And the people swarmed from the arena up to where I was. And I could see by the look on their faces, this is hundreds of people, that the Leafs lost. They were so identified with the outcome of the game that it is as if they lost. It wasn't a bunch of overpaid millionaires on the ice playing another bunch of overpaid millionaires on the ice. It was like they lost and they had internalized it. And that was an extreme state of emotional identification. I remember when I was in England and the World Cup, or it was the Euro Cup, was going on, and I was driving a taxi at that point. This is quite a few years ago. And the other taxi drivers, they didn't want to work when the World Cup or the Euro Cup was on, particularly when Britain was playing, and I don't care about soccer or football as they called it. I could tell when England lost just by looking at the expressions of people on the street. So, there are many different ways that we identify. You go into the Marine Corps and you do your basic training and they strip you of your name and they call you private. And then they put you in this uniform and they lift the uniform up. The military are experts at harnessing this use of identification and various different things to keep people in that lower level. And, the various other forms, that we talked about, like identification. And considering is actually a form of identification. According to Mr. Gurdjieff, I'm identified with me, and it's fueled by Monsieur Self-Love and Madame Vanity, and how could they look at me like that? And it's raining on purpose. People get upset at the weather, like the weather was conspiring against them. That's internal considering. Negative emotions, but it's always a me. How can it happen to me? The anger. I can't believe she said that to me. I just want to grab them, and or it's like the total fear, like I'm going to die, I'm hurt, or this depression, this wallowing in despair. And then I've been doing a lot of talking. Another form is unnecessary talking. There are some people who they just can't be quiet. My mother was one. If there was no one around, she'd talk to her plant. She'd talk to her cat. She just talked and nattered and nattered and nattered, and always talking, always talking. She didn't have an appreciation of silence and quietness, and there are people who do a lot of unnecessary talking. They're unable to sit quietly in the moment. And then, as I mentioned earlier, lying. And lying isn't, what is your name? My name's Fred. It's not necessarily overtly lying. There's so much lying that goes on that we don't even realize. One major form of lying is, hey, how are things? Oh, they're good. How's it going? It's going okay. How are you? I'm good. When we may have a toothache or we haven't slept that night. Someone asks, we walk by a friend in the street and they go, hey, how are things? And you go, good. They don't want you to go, well, I didn't sleep last night and I have a toothache, and they don't want you to start talking honestly. And this is something that Mr. Gurdjieff had a problem with parents. He was known as Mr. Bonbon, Mr. Candy, and he'd walk around with these hard candies in his pocket and give them away to children in the streets in Paris. And then the parents would go, what do you say? What do you say? And I'd be guilty of this as a parent. Thank you. And he said that was creating insincerity. And this is how the personality forms from the essence. Somewhere around the age of 5 or 6, we learn how to be insincere. We learn how to put on this fake front that grows into our personality. And so we don't engage in a very real and truthful way with the world. Other ways I mentioned of lying is claiming expertise of things that you can't possibly know. There's a belief that if you can name it, well, you understand it. So, you're walking through a park and you look at a leaf and someone goes, and they give the Latin name, and you think, wow, this person knows. All they know is the Latin name. And saying and speaking like that is a form of lying. Journalists do it all the time. They go and interview a specialist in a field, and then they write up an article, and in the article it makes them seem like they know what they're talking about, when they've just taken notes and they know how to turn the notes into unplagiarized words and just put it in their own way and put it in a proper structure. But they don't really have that deep understanding of what's going on. And so we lie incessantly. As I mentioned, beliefs are a lie. A belief is a mental shortcut so we don't have to think about something. Does God exist? Of course he exists. The Bible says so. That's a belief, without really asking, why do I know this? How do I know this? So those are all ways we lie. Formatory thinking is just the whirling of our thoughts, that whirling of our thoughts from when we wake up to when we go to sleep. It's a way of wasting energy, learning how to control those thoughts, learning how to turn them off, how to still them, or have mindful thoughts, is to not engage in formatory thinking. And then imagination and daydreaming. I have to say that a lot of people in the Gurdjieff teachings think imagination is wrong, which is wrong. Mr. Gurdjieff talked about a higher form of imagination. There's that mindful imagination, the proper use of imagination, and then there's the lower form. And the lower form is hijacked by the ego, and it's hijacked by the emotional center. Not the clear thinking, not the clear use of our imagination. And when Madame de Salzman said, you know, in terms of the breathing exercise, represent to yourself the active elements of the air. She could have just said, imagine the active elements of the air, but they didn't want to translate what she wrote in French into English using the word imagination. So they said, represent to yourself. That's actually a proper use of imagination. Usually what happens is the imagination is hijacked by the emotion, and beneath the imagination is the ego. So active being mentation, which I mentioned in a previous meeting, is the twin of self-remembering. But active being mentation, it's where you're aware of your body and you're using your mind to actively mentate while maintaining the sensation of the self and doing it free from the ego. So active being mentation is actually a higher form of imagination, but most people are not able to engage in active being mentation. There, I've gone through a lot today. I wanted to really discuss, you know, about mindfulness and the inward detachment and the fact that the real I is inherent. It's there. It's the energy that's fueling every form of mindful awareness, and to talk about these different things. And I want to, you know, devote more time to really going in and exploring identification and other things in future meetings. But I've covered everything I want to do today. Any questions, any comments?
I have a more general question. So where exactly can all of this information be found? Because I've been listening to like some audiobooks of like Tales and Meetings with Remarkable Men, and then the Life is Only Real Then If I Am.
Then When
book.
I Am, yeah. And,
Right.
and that
And
book, that just a quick aside, life is only real then when I am. The I am. The I am is the real I. So it's not, you know, then when I am. I am is that real self. But you can't find it in all of these books.
Or so like for instance, like the stuff about like the hydrogens and
okay,
even like some of the stuff.
I mean, the hydrogens are basically found in two main places. I don't fully recommend the second one unless you want to bang your head over and over and over and over again. The second place where it's located is in the chapter Holy Purgatory, the chapter on purgatory in Beelzebub Tales to his grandson. But there, it's there, but you really, really have to work at it. The other place where it's mostly located is in chapter 9 of In Search of the Miraculous. And chapter 9 is the part of In Search of the Miraculous that when I give the book to people to introduce them to the teachings, I tell them, read the chapter, you won't understand it. Just read it, but you won't get the full understanding of it because it's so complex. It's something you have to circle around and around and around. And it took me a long time to begin making sense of it. The diagram that I showed, you know, with the various levels and, you know, all of that, this diagram actually comes from chapter 9, but you will not find this in chapter 9. There's a rudimentary diagram in chapter 9 where Mr. Gurdjieff goes through and explains the octave of food. But I read chapter 9 over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And I kept that initial diagram beside my bed. So it was the last thing I saw when I went to sleep and the first thing I saw when I woke up. And then I began to re-represent it. And as I re-represented it, I put it into this form and this fashion. Just let me see if I can find this is not quite right. There's some mistakes in this, but it's okay. Let me just share it. This is forget the colors and forget the different labels. This is the way the food diagram, the diagram that I have, is represented in Search of the Miraculous. I'm just I don't want you to focus on it too much because there are slight mistakes in that. Just the way it's initially represented. I don't know why I can't find the original food diagrams. Yeah, they've got to be somewhere in my. Oh, maybe it's in. Here it is. Okay, this is the original one from In Search of the Miraculous. This is the one that is in. It is in the book In Search of the Miraculous. So you can't quite, it's much easier to understand what I'm talking about, like Do 768, 364, this is the octave of food. Here, the Do 48, Ray 24, this is the octave of impressions. And over here is the octave of emotions. Not quite as clear as the way I represent it, but that's where you can find it. And I mean, you find it also throughout the teachings. But just, coming into the teachings new, it's not apparent. I'm probably one of the world's experts at this point on this dimension of the teachings because it was the part that really interested me. So what I've actually just said in this meeting, you will not find written down anywhere, the way I put it all together and the way I understand it. But so this is filtered through me. I believe I'm correct. And I've always said if people can show me where I'm wrong and they can connect it to the teachings, I will change what I say. And there was a time when I changed a couple of things years ago, but it's been a while since people have confronted me and I've got, oh, yeah, you're right. I was doing this wrong. I thought about this wrong. I put a lot of time and effort into this.
Thank you. Okay.
Any other questions? We still have 10 minutes to go. I'll have a bit more coffee.
Go ahead.
I don't know if it's actually a question, but I know in Mr. Gurdjieff's works, there's a fairly strong differentiation between self-observation and self-remembering.
Yeah.
Or at least that's how I've understood it. I'm not going to know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could kind of clarify how they're different from each other.
Well, self-remembering is at its, basic level is consciously looking, so receiving visual impressions, consciously hearing, consciously smelling, consciously tasting, so holding in the back of our awareness the sensation of self, and possibly breathing. Feeling and being aware of feeling, being aware of emotion. This is the act of self-remembering. As I said, anything in the Gurdjieff teachings that is preceded with the word self in a hyphen is an act of mindful awareness. So self-sensing is an act of mindful awareness. Self-study and self-observations are acts of mindful awareness. So in order to observe yourself, you have to engage in self-observation. But you can't fully observe yourself without bringing that hydrogen 24, which fuels the mindful awareness into the process. So self-remembering is either a 2 or 3 brained, depending on the level of complexity, awareness done in the proper form and sequence. So, my head brain, the external impressions, my body brain, the sensory impressions, and my feeling brain at the highest level. But this energy that fuels this can also fuel the observation of ourself. But you cannot observe yourself in a state of identification. You can only observe yourself after you have become aware that you are identified. And because you're bringing this higher energy, you are no longer in that state of identification. So basically, using the analogy of the light, shining the light on my hand, shining the light on my body to develop the sensation. This light is the higher awareness, and we can shine it on different aspects of our being. Boy, I was really identified with that football game. I can't believe my heart or whatever. Um, Emotional identification. I stopped watching television shows because I realized that they were inducing a state of emotional identification. They were controlling my emotions. They were putting me into a stress, anxiety, anxious state. You watch, murders or police procedurals or thrillers, and it's like you're gripping the armrest, and they provoke the anxiety response. And I began to observe it, and I began to observe. So self-observation, the kind of control those television shows, and I like the police procedurals and the murders and the stuff like that, the cop shows. I liked those shows, but then I realized I began to observe. So I brought that higher form of awareness to myself and realizing I want to be in control of my emotions. I don't want my emotions to be controlled. I want to act rather than react. I don't know if that answers your question, but
I mean, it kind of touches on it, especially towards the end, because I was thinking, the way we discuss self-remembering here is very, as you said, it's the body, sensing the body, and then being aware of and that's a whole kind of an exercise. It's something that you're engaged in.
Yeah.
Whereas self-observation and the way you're talking about it, just noticing things about ourselves. So, oh wow, I got really angry when that guy cut me off in traffic, or oh, I can't, I got really caught up in this story about I got to get groceries and I don't have time, and is it whatever. And
I
step back and notice it.
I got really
not
angry.
As much as next.
Yeah, I got really angry when that guy cut me off in traffic. There's that inward detachment that is inherent in every form of mindful awareness. The detaching, the real I's actually involved in it. When you're in that state, you can't observe it. It's like, I can't believe how angry I got. If you've ever tried, if you've been with a friend and they've gotten so angry and you've tried to get themselves to look at themselves, they can't. At a certain point, it's like, oh, I can't believe how I lost it. So you're bringing that awareness into the process. It's, rather than think of it as, specific techniques and aspects and dimensions that are involved in building up this self-remembering, this awareness of me here and what I'm feeling, it's the same energy. And, think of the energy as a light, and you have to pull the light out, detach, that inward detachment to observe. So you can't observe yourself in that moment. You got angry and you're screaming at the person who cut you off. But you go, and you inwardly detach. In other words, you tap into that higher energy and you think, oh, that's what I did. And I mean, the thing about things like road rage or getting upset at drivers is we've done it so often that we can begin to build up this mental picture of it. And it becomes more readily observable because we've done it so many times. And quite often we'll do it and then we'll have someone beside us looking at us like with horror. I remember my ex-wife, when she was my girlfriend, I was living on campus. We met in residence. First time she was in a car with me when I was driving, it was like I'd become Mr. Jekyll. And she was shocked. And, and she just, I can't, and she really helped me see myself just by giving me that detachment, that detached perspective. And it's like, yeah, I do. I became like Mr. Jekyll in a car. I don't do it anymore, but I got honking and yelling, and a lot of people, they do that. The car becomes this extension of themselves, and they don't realize what they're doing when they're doing it. And if they realized, they wouldn't do it. So
thank you. Yes.
Yeah. We'll explore. I want to explore, all of those 7 different features. I've just briefly introduced them, but I want to bring up quotes and go into them a little bit more detailed. Going back to using what Mr. Gurdjieff actually said about them, rather than filtered through my awareness, and discussing them in greater detail. So we will work through these things. Any other comments, questions? How often have you guys been bringing yourself back to yourself throughout this? The awareness of yourself. This is the most important thing we can do because it has to be in second position. First position is the consciously receiving external impressions. And the second position, to have that sensation of self. And as I went back, I don't know if it was, forget the last meeting or the meeting before, when I pulled up the section from Beelzebub Tales, where he talks about it. He talks about the holy denying. If we don't occupy the body brain with self-sensing, and if self-sensing is not in second position, all sorts of things can go wrong. And this is why it's so important to develop this awareness so that we can hold this awareness. If you could be in class, for instance, Ben, and keep a part of your awareness in your body, you will be receiving the information that your professors will be teaching you in the proper way, and you will remember it more. When we receive impressions and everything's willy-nilly, we don't remember things, we don't have the clarity. That's the other thing about mindfulness. When we are mindful, we tend to remember things. I remember my son saying, "Dad, why didn't you tell me that when I self-remember, as I put my keys down, I will never forget where they are?" It's just like, I didn't think about telling you that, but now that you've told me that, I know you're doing it correctly. So whatever we learn in that mindful state, if you can be mindful, Ben, in class, when you're, in term, you will remember information better than if you are in a state of identification and mindlessness. It's bringing that higher energy into the process, particularly if you can hold in the back of your awareness the sensation of your body. At any rate, it is now noon here in Toronto, and I guess, Ben, it's noon for you, and it's 11:30, or actually, it's 11:30 for Guido in Colombia, and 10 o'clock, is it? No, it's 9 o'clock for 9 o'clock for Ian in Portland, Oregon. So thank you all for coming, and same time next week. And take care. Have a wonderful day, and bring yourself back to yourself. Okay, bye now.
All right, bye-bye.